In the solemn courtroom, a tense atmosphere enveloped everyone present. Seated on the high bench, the powerful judge leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze sweeping over those before him. His face bore an unmistakable arrogance, and the corners of his lips curled into a mocking smile each time the defendant tried to defend himself. When the defense attorney stood up to present his arguments, the judge didn't bother to hide his boredom. He crossed his arms over his chest, shook his head, and suddenly interrupted with a cold, derisive tone. "Ridiculous. Do you really think these words will change my verdict?" For a moment, the entire courtroom fell silent. The defendant, his face pale with anxiety, tried to remain calm, but his hands clenched tightly together, his desperate eyes searching for even the slightest glimmer of hope. Yet, all he received in return was a look of disdain from the very man who held his fate in his hands. The judge slowly flipped through the case files, then suddenly let out a scornful chuckle. Tilting his head, he looked straight at the defendant, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you really see yourself as the victim? Don't expect any sympathy here." Each of his words was like a sharp blade, cutting deeper into the despair of those seeking justice. The spectators exchanged uneasy glances, some lowered their heads in silence, while others frowned in discomfort, yet no one dared to speak up. Below, the defendant's lawyer clenched his fists, struggling to remain composed. He took a deep breath, summoning all his courage to continue defending his client, but deep inside, a sense of helplessness welled up. Justice was meant to be a balanced scale, yet here, it was being distorted by the arrogance of one man. Does a judge have the right to turn a courtroom into a stage for ridicule? And can justice truly prevail when the one holding the scales refuses to acknowledge the suffering of those pleading for fairness? The courtroom was drowning in an air of silent submission, thick with the weight of injustice. The judge sat high above, his lips curled into a smirk of superiority as he toyed with his gavel, savoring the moment before delivering what was clearly a predetermined verdict. The defendant, a man who had lost all hope, sat slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on the cold marble floor. Around them, the murmurs of spectators filled the space, a mix of pity and resignation. No one expected anything but another unjust ruling. Then, without warning, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a force that startled everyone inside. The sharp, rhythmic click of heels against the polished floor cut through the hushed atmosphere, drawing every eye to the figure that had just entered. A woman strode in with purpose, her navy blue suit immaculate, her auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun that only emphasized the sharp angles of her determined face. She carried herself with an air of unwavering confidence, her green eyes scanning the room with a piercing intensity. There was no hesitation in her steps, no fear in her demeanor. She was here on a mission, and everyone could feel it. The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the courtroom like a rising tide. People whispered her name in hushed voices, as though speaking it too loudly might shatter the fragile illusion of the judge's unchecked power. Lacey Ross. A name that struck fear into corrupt officials and inspired hope in those desperate for justice. She was known for her razor-sharp arguments, her ability to dismantle even the most ironclad cases with nothing more than cold, hard facts. Judges feared her, prosecutors loathed her, and defendants saw her as their last chance at salvation. And today, she had arrived without warning, stepping into the courtroom like a force of nature. Judge Anderson's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly, his expression hardening into a mask of irritation. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the bench as he regarded her with thinly veiled contempt. "And who, exactly, do you think you are to barge into my courtroom uninvited?" he demanded, his voice laced with condescension. Lacey didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she walked straight to the defense table, her heels clicking with each deliberate step. Without so much as a glance at the judge, she set her leather-bound case file down with a measured precision, as if marking her territory. Then, lifting her chin, she turned to face him directly. "Lacey Ross," she stated, her voice firm, unshaken. "Legal representative for the defense." The tension in the room skyrocketed. The defendant, who had moments ago seemed resigned to his fate, lifted his head, his dull eyes flickering with something he had almost forgotten, hope. He stared at Lacey as if she were a mirage in the desert, too good to be real. Judge Anderson scoffed, the smirk creeping back onto his face as he leaned back in his chair. "You're too late. We were just about to conclude." Lacey met his gaze with an expression so calm, so unwavering, it was almost unnerving. Slowly, deliberately, she placed both hands on the table and leaned forward just enough for her voice to carry through the tense silence. "Then I guess it's a good thing I arrived just in time," she said smoothly. The judge's smirk twitched. Lacey's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Because if you were about to pass a verdict without properly reviewing the facts, I'd say that's not justice, it's abuse of power." The room fell into a stunned silence. The judge's fingers curled around his gavel, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own courtroom. And certainly not by someone with a reputation like Lacey Ross. The energy in the room had shifted. No longer was it a space ruled by the whims of a single man. No longer was injustice an inevitability. Because now, Lacey Ross stood between the accused and a system that had long abandoned fairness. And she wasn't leaving until the truth was heard. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Lacey Ross strode forward, her footsteps deliberate and measured, cutting through the silence. She had entered with a quiet but undeniable confidence, her posture unyielding as her eyes locked with Judge Anderson's. The tension was thick, a tangible presence that hovered between them. The judge's gaze was sharp, his brow furrowed in a mixture of irritation and disbelief. He had expected this day to unfold smoothly, with his dominance unquestioned, but here was Lacey, a young woman unafraid to challenge the system. Judge Anderson's eyes narrowed as she stood before him, and the veins on his neck began to bulge with restrained fury. He had never been one to suffer challenges to his authority, especially not from someone like Lacey, who was so clearly out of place in his courtroom. She was young, brash, and, in his opinion, far too idealistic for her own good. "You've got some nerve coming in here and questioning my courtroom." The judge's voice cracked through the air, dripping with condescension. "You've interrupted my court, disrespected my authority, and now, you're going to lecture me? Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Lacey stood her ground, her eyes unwavering, her shoulders square. Her expression was calm but resolute, and in the stillness of the courtroom, the strength of her presence was undeniable. She had come for a reason, and nothing would deter her from speaking the truth. "It's not about questioning your authority, Judge Anderson," Lacey replied, her voice cool but with a force that reverberated through the room. "It's about calling out the injustice you're perpetuating in this courtroom." For a moment, the room held its breath, unsure of where this confrontation would lead. The judge's lips twisted in a sneer, clearly growing more agitated by the second. "Injustice," he scoffed. "I don't need lectures from someone like you. I've seen everything I need to see. Your defendant is guilty. There's no question about it." Lacey's gaze never wavered. She could feel her pulse quickening, but her voice remained steady. "It's not your job to decide guilt before the evidence is presented. What you've done here today is mock him, belittle him, and condemn him based on your own bias. That's not justice, Judge, it's prejudice." She could see the veins in his temples throbbing, the way his hands clenched into fists beneath the bench. His face flushed red, and for a moment, she thought he might explode in anger. But Lacey held his gaze, refusing to look away. She had seen this before, the arrogance, the dismissiveness, the way some people clung to their power as though it were unassailable. But Lacey knew better. She had witnessed too many lives ruined by this very same attitude, and she wasn't about to let it continue. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to run my courtroom?" Judge Anderson spat, his words dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a nuisance. You think I'm biased? You think I don't know what I'm doing?" Lacey's pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. The room was watching, and the weight of their eyes only fueled her resolve. She could feel the energy in the room shifting, the silent tension hanging thick in the air as if everyone present knew something crucial was at stake. "I think you've already made up your mind about my client," Lacey said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the room. "And that's exactly the problem. You've dismissed him before you've even heard his side of the story. You've mocked him for his past, for where he comes from, and for how he looks. That's not justice, Judge. That's prejudice. The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, even the judge hesitated. His face contorted with a mix of disbelief and anger, but beneath it, there was something else, something he hadn't expected: doubt. His gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating throughout the room. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked, his voice shaking with fury. "You will not lecture me in my own courtroom." But Lacey didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back in fear, nor did she raise her voice in anger. She simply stepped forward, her eyes steady, her posture unwavering. "You can try to silence me, Judge, but you can't escape the truth. You may have power in this courtroom, but you do not have the right to decide someone's fate based on your own prejudices." The room was utterly still now. It was as if time had stopped, and every eye was trained on the confrontation between the young attorney and the powerful judge. Lacey knew the stakes. She knew what this moment could mean for her career, for the defendant, and for the very fabric of the justice system. And yet, she felt no fear, only a deep sense of purpose. The judge's hands shook slightly as he gripped the sides of his bench, the lines of his face deepening with frustration. He was used to being the one in control, the one who commanded respect, but in this moment, it was Lacey who held the power. It wasn't in her voice or her actions, it was in her unwavering belief that justice could be more than what was being handed down. "You're nothing but a troublemaker, Ms. Ross," the judge growled, his voice now dangerously low. "I'll have you removed from this courtroom if you don't show respect." Lacey met his gaze one last time, her expression calm but piercing. "And I'll take that as a sign that I'm doing the right thing. Because sometimes, Judge, the only way to fix a broken system is to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." For a brief moment, there was silence, heavy, pregnant with possibility. Then, slowly, the judge leaned back in his chair, a defeated exhale escaping his lips. His gavel was still raised, but this time, it was as though it didn't have the same weight. Lacey had spoken. And though the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, she had made her mark. The mockery and the prejudice that had once seemed unshakable were now under scrutiny, and for the first time in a long while, the scales of justice felt just a little more balanced. Lacey Ross could feel her breath catch in her throat when the man in front of her slowly reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against something hard. Her mind raced, unsure of what to expect. The tension in the courtroom hung heavy, the heated exchange between her and Judge Anderson still lingering in the air. She was just starting to collect herself after the confrontation when the man withdrew a gleaming badge. The metallic shine caught the light, briefly blinding her as she instinctively took a step back. She froze as her eyes focused on the words etched across the badge, U.S. Secret Service. It was like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and for a moment, everything went silent except for the blood rushing in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to comprehend what was happening, but it couldn't keep up with the chaos flooding in. The man before her was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, something that might have made him look like an ordinary lawyer or businessman, but the badge he held up was anything but ordinary. It felt like an invasion, something foreign, unwelcomed, and yet undeniably real. "Excuse me?" Lacey's voice was barely above a whisper, the disbelief evident in her words. Her heart drummed heavily in her chest, her breath shallow as she struggled to make sense of it all. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" The man's face remained emotionless. He didn't smile. His eyes were cold, piercing as they locked onto hers. There was a quiet intensity to him, something that made Lacey's stomach churn with unease. "I said," he repeated, his tone still composed, "I'm with the U.S. Secret Service. I need you to come with me." A flood of emotions washed over Lacey. Confusion. Fear. Anger. But beneath it all, there was something darker, something primal in her that screamed danger. She tried to swallow the lump that had formed in her throat, but her voice betrayed her when she spoke again. What do you mean?" Her mind raced. Was this a setup? Was this some kind of retaliation for her defense of her client? Had she gone too far in her challenge against the system? Her thoughts scrambled for an explanation that made sense, but the man's presence before her only made the sense slip further away. The courtroom, still reeling from her argument with Judge Anderson, seemed to still. Everyone around her was frozen, their gazes flitting between Lacey and the man standing before her. She glanced over at Judge Anderson, whose usual haughty demeanor was replaced by something unreadable, something that sent a shiver up her spine. Was that fear in his eyes? It was fleeting, but it was there. And it only made her more anxious. Lacey's pulse quickened. I don't understand. This isn't happening. She shook her head, her thoughts scrambling for an anchor. You can't just, what is going on? The man's expression remained neutral, but she noticed his jaw tighten, just slightly, as if her resistance was expected but unwelcome. I'm afraid this is happening, Miss Ross. You need to come with me. It's not just a matter of legal procedure anymore. It's a matter of your safety. Lacey could feel the weight of his words, though they seemed so surreal, so far removed from the legal battles she had fought for years. Her safety, she was no stranger to conflict, to standing her ground against powerful people, but this felt different. This was bigger. A pit began to form in her stomach as she looked into his unwavering eyes. What had she gotten herself into? Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak again. Safety? From what? Who are you really? The man didn't hesitate. You've caught the attention of individuals who have much more power than you or I could ever imagine. You're involved in something far bigger than just this case. People are watching, and they don't care about the law. The words struck Lacey like a physical blow. Involved in something bigger, she was just doing her job. She had always prided herself on fighting for the underdog, on challenging the system when it was wrong. This wasn't just some random case, it was her life's work. But the realization that her fight might have led her into dangerous waters made her blood run cold. She shook her head, trying to regain some sense of control. This doesn't make sense. I was just defending my client. I was just doing my job. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and the weight of her own words pressed down on her. She didn't know whether she was trying to convince him or herself. The man's gaze softened just a fraction, but there was no mercy in it. I understand. But what you don't understand is that you've stirred something. You've uncovered something. And now, there are people who will do anything to make sure you stop. A chill ran down Lacey's spine as his words sank in. Her instincts were screaming at her now. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of law and order. It felt like a trap. Every corner of the room seemed to hold a shadow, every face seemed to hold a secret. The man stepped closer, his presence looming now, undeniable. You need to come with me, Miss Ross. Now. Before it's too late. Lacey stood still, paralyzed, the room spinning around her. Every logical part of her mind screamed at her to refuse, to stand her ground, but her body had already betrayed her. It was as if some invisible force was pushing her forward, urging her to comply. But the weight of the unknown still clung to her like a shroud, and she couldn't help but wonder what she was walking into. The eyes of everyone in the room seemed to focus on her, as if they, too, were waiting for her next move. Lacey didn't know if they were watching out of concern or curiosity, but she knew one thing for certain: her next step could change everything. There was no turning back now. With a final, shaky breath, she lifted her chin and turned to face the man. I'm not going anywhere until I understand exactly what's happening. What are you involved in? What's at stake here? The man's expression didn't falter, but Lacey could see the briefest flicker of something: resignation, maybe, or pity. You'll understand soon enough, Miss Ross. But you don't have time to question anymore. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep you silent. Lacey swallowed, the fight inside her growing stronger. She wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not ever. But as she stepped toward him, she realized that she was stepping into a world that she hadn't been prepared for. The reality of her situation was settling in, and though she didn't know where this path would lead, she knew that everything she thought she knew was about to change forever. "Lead the way," she said, her voice steady, even though every fiber of her being screamed in protest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever lay ahead, but she had no choice. The shock of the badge had shattered her world, but now it was time to face the unknown. Lacey's voice cut through the thick, oppressive silence in the courtroom. It was firm, sharp, and carried with it an undeniable sense of determination. The air seemed to grow heavier as her words struck like a hammer against a cold, unyielding wall. "You want me to stay quiet. You want me to be intimidated into submission, to back down from what I know is the truth. But that's not who I am. I'm not here to be silenced. And I'm certainly not here to let you get away with this." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on her, but Lacey didn't flinch. Inside, her heart was pounding like a drum, and a cold sweat began to bead on her forehead, but she held her ground. She could feel the tension rise, thick and suffocating, but it didn't scare her. No. What scared her was not standing up for what was right. What terrified her was letting herself be swept into the system she had spent her entire career fighting against. Her eyes locked on the man in front of her, his cold, calculating gaze hidden behind the badge of power. His expression was a mixture of disdain and condescension, but Lacey didn't back down. The more she looked at him, the more she could see the truth behind his eyes. He wasn't just trying to manipulate her. He was trying to crush her spirit. He wanted her to feel small, insignificant, powerless. And for a brief moment, she almost felt it. Almost. But then, the anger surged again, hotter and more intense than before. She was tired. Tired of being underestimated, tired of the system bending over backwards for people like him, tired of seeing the powerful get away with what they pleased while the truth remained buried beneath layers of lies. "You think you can intimidate me? You think this badge gives you the right to break the law, to control the narrative?" Lacey continued, her voice rising with each word. She felt the heat of the courtroom around her, but instead of stifling her, it fueled her. The more she spoke, the more empowered she felt. She could feel the tide shifting within her, like a tidal wave breaking against a dam. She wouldn't be silenced. Not now. Not ever. Her mind raced as she spoke, but every word came from a place deep within her. She was no longer just defending herself. No. This wasn't just about her. It was about every client she had fought for, every case she had worked tirelessly on, every moment of injustice that had gone unchallenged. She was standing for all of them now. "You've spent so long trying to control everything, trying to bend the system to your will, and now you want to control me? Well, I'm not your pawn. I won't be bullied into staying silent." Lacey's fists clenched at her sides, her knuckles turning white, but she didn't care. She felt alive in that moment, like she was on the verge of something monumental. She was tired of cowering, tired of waiting for permission to speak the truth. The man stood motionless, his gaze unwavering. But Lacey could feel the tension shift. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. He wasn't used to people not backing down. And that realization gave her a strange sense of power. It wasn't about her words anymore, it was about her refusal to give in, her decision to stand up, no matter the cost. "You think you're in control? You think you can just shut me up because you have a badge and a position of power? I know the truth, and I will not be bullied. I will not stop until the world sees what you've done," Lacey spat, her voice dripping with a fierce, unwavering conviction. Her heart was racing, but she had never felt more alive. She had nothing left to lose. She was not the one with something to fear. She took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the cold marble floor. The movement was deliberate, calculated, a challenge. She could see the man's jaw tighten, a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe, or frustration, crossing his face. Lacey pressed on. Her eyes never left his as she continued, each word stronger, bolder, more defiant than the last. "I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not afraid of what might come next. You can threaten me, try to scare me, but I'm not backing down. I am not like the others you've tried to silence. I'm not afraid of your tactics. I won't let you twist the truth to serve your own agenda. The man's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a fleeting glimpse of hesitation before he masked it. Lacey saw it. She saw the flicker of doubt, the moment of weakness. It was so brief, but it was enough. Enough to show her that her words were cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. And that knowledge filled her with a sense of pride. She had him on the defensive. She had shaken him. You think I'm just going to roll over and let you walk all over me? You're mistaken. I know the law better than you. And I know that what you're doing is not just unethical, it's illegal. And I will expose you for what you are, Lacey said, her voice steady now, more controlled, but no less fierce. The man opened his mouth as if to respond, but Lacey cut him off. Don't bother trying to intimidate me further. I've heard it all before. This is not just about me anymore. This is about justice, about truth, and I'm willing to fight for it, no matter what it costs. The man seemed to pause, his lips pressing together in a tight line. His eyes flicked briefly toward the others in the room, perhaps looking for reassurance, but all he saw were silent witnesses. He was alone in his power. And in that moment, Lacey felt the ground beneath her steady and sure. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been pushed aside, silenced, and ignored. He took a step back, a small but telling sign of retreat. Lacey didn't let up. She stayed firm, her back straight, her posture proud. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. With one final glance at the man, Lacey turned her attention back to the courtroom, to the truth she had come to reveal. The truth is the only thing that matters, she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of someone who knew she was on the right side of history. And I won't rest until it's brought to light. In that moment, the courtroom was hers. And nothing would stop her from finishing what she started. The tension in the courtroom reached an unbearable height after Lacey's impassioned declaration. As her words echoed through the room, they seemed to hang in the air, leaving everyone momentarily paralyzed. Her accusation was not just an ordinary statement, it was a direct challenge, not only to the defendant but to the very foundation of the case being built against him. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, and it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath. Lacey stood tall, her back straight, hands clenched by her sides as she stared unwaveringly at the judge. There was no doubt in her mind now, this was the moment. Everything she had fought for, every piece of evidence, every sleepless night, had led to this. And yet, even as she had spoken those words aloud, her heart thundered in her chest. This was the risk, the one that could either break her or make her case stronger than ever. But there was no turning back. She had committed herself, and now she would see it through to the end. The judge, seated high on his podium, remained motionless. His hands were clasped together, his fingers interlaced as he stared at Lacey with narrowed eyes. His expression was unreadable, giving nothing away. He was a man who had seen many attorneys, many defendants, but there was something about Lacey Ross that unsettled him. She had a fire in her that was not easily extinguished. And as he watched her, he wondered, had she gone too far this time? The prosecutor, too, shifted in his seat. His face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks as Lacey's words settled in. This wasn't the script he had planned for the day. He had anticipated resistance from the defense, but not this unyielding defiance, this boldness that threatened to upend the entire trial. His jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table, but he said nothing. He knew better than to challenge Lacey right then. She had captured the courtroom's attention, and to interrupt her now would make him appear weak, disorganized. All eyes were on her. The jury, who had been following the proceedings with varying degrees of interest, now seemed fully engaged, their gazes fixed on Lacey as if she had just revealed the ultimate truth. Some of them were nodding subtly, the initial skepticism in their faces giving way to something resembling respect. Others were still trying to process the weight of what had just happened. This was no ordinary case, no ordinary day in court. Lacey's words had torn through the facade of legal arguments, and now, the lines between right and wrong, justice and manipulation, had blurred. The judge, still silent, took a long, deliberate breath. There was no denying it, Lacey had challenged the courtroom's expectations, and there was something almost admiring in his eyes as he regarded her. But this was still his courtroom. And while he had respect for the strength of her conviction, the law must come first. He wasn't one to tolerate disruptions, no matter how justified the cause might seem. Finally, he brought the gavel down with a sharp crack, his voice piercing the thick tension in the air. "Order in the court," he commanded, but his voice, though firm, lacked its usual commanding presence. It wasn't just authority in his tone, it was a trace of something else, something uncertain. He wasn't sure how to handle the charge Lacey had just thrown at the court. And he knew it. Lacey, however, didn't flinch. She wasn't intimidated by the judge's attempt to regain control. She had already taken the first step into uncharted territory, and there was no looking back. She met his eyes without hesitation, her gaze unwavering, though a storm churned beneath her calm exterior. Her heart still raced, her pulse quickened, but outwardly, she remained composed. She had been to hell and back to get to this moment, there was nothing that could unsettle her now. "Ms. Ross," the judge said, his voice cutting through her thoughts, "I must remind you that this is a court of law, not a stage for personal vendettas or emotional outbursts." His words were cold, but Lacey could detect a flicker of something deeper beneath them. Was it uncertainty? Perhaps even a hint of respect? But it was quickly masked by his usual sternness. "Accusations like the one you've made cannot be taken lightly. You will need evidence to support your claims." Lacey's chest tightened for a split second. She had expected this, of course, she had. But hearing it aloud, from the very person who controlled the course of the trial, made the challenge all the more real. She knew she could not falter now. She had taken a stand, and she would stand her ground. "I understand, Your Honor," Lacey replied, her voice steady, with a trace of steel beneath the calm. "But I assure you, I will bring that evidence. The truth will come out, and I will make sure it is heard." Her words, though measured, were laced with a confidence that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just promising to follow through with her case, she was vowing to bring the truth to light, regardless of the cost. The entire room seemed to lean in as her words settled, heavy and resolute. The judge regarded her with a measured look. There was no condemnation in his gaze, no anger, but a certain appraisal. It was clear he was evaluating her, considering her every word. "Very well, Ms. Ross," he said, his tone softer than before. "You will have your opportunity to present your case. But let this be a reminder, this is not a place for theatrics. The truth must be grounded in facts, not accusations alone." Lacey nodded slightly, but the movement was more than just acknowledgement, it was a silent promise. She would meet the judge's challenge. She would deliver the evidence, the truth, and she would prove her case. There was no other option. As the judge slammed the gavel down once more, signaling the brief recess, the tension in the room remained thick. The prosecutor was still trying to mask his frustration, his face a careful mask of composure. The jury sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the challenge that had just unfolded before them. Lacey stood there for a moment, feeling the eyes of the room on her. The battle had just begun, but she felt an unfamiliar calm wash over her. This was her fight. And she would not back down. She had come too far, and the truth was on her side. With one last, quiet breath, Lacey turned and walked back to her seat. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was ready. The courtroom, once a place of controlled order, had now become a battleground, and Lacey Ross was prepared to fight. The recess in the courtroom was not a mere pause. For Lacey, it felt like a turning point. She could feel the weight of the moment, the intensity in the air as if the room was holding its breath. It wasn't just about a tactical move or an argument anymore, it was about asserting her presence. She had done what no one expected, she had challenged not only the prosecutor's case, but the very dynamic of the courtroom itself. Lacey sat back, her fingers drumming lightly on the wooden table in front of her, but her mind was anything but idle. There had been a moment, right before she had delivered that last piece of evidence, when she had caught the prosecutor's eye. And in that split second, she saw it, doubt. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He had been so sure of his victory, so confident in the proceedings up until that point. But now, his unshakable armor had been cracked. Lacey's breath steadied, a quiet satisfaction simmering inside her. The feeling was strange, almost intoxicating. She had always known that she was capable of this, but experiencing it firsthand, feeling the subtle shift in power, was different than any victory she had known. It wasn't about triumphing in the usual ways, it was about control, about forcing everyone in that room to acknowledge her strength, her presence, her intellect. She could see the prosecutor consulting with his colleague, both of them murmuring quietly, stealing glances at her, trying to plot their next move. Their attempts to regain control were almost laughable. Lacey had disrupted the rhythm of the trial, and now, it felt like they were playing catch-up, trying to keep pace with her strategy. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated her. But she wasn't about to let them recover easily. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. The quiet hum of the courtroom grew louder as the judge brought the session back to order. The gavel echoed in the room, but the usual authority behind it now felt like a formality, like a prelude to something far bigger. Lacey's heart beat in time with the reverberation of the gavel, steady and focused. She wasn't just waiting for her turn. She wasn't just responding to the motions of the court. She was ready to continue this fight on her terms. As she stood up, slowly, deliberately, she felt the eyes of every single person in that room fall on her. The jury's gaze was piercing, their collective focus sharp as if they could sense the shift too. They had watched as the prosecutor steered the case with his familiar authority, but now, it was different. Lacey could almost feel the jury leaning in, their curiosity piqued. She wasn't just an attorney in this moment, she was a force. The prosecutor rose next, but his movements lacked the same assuredness. His back was straight, but there was an almost imperceptible tension in his posture, a slight tightness to his jaw. He was scrambling, trying to regain control of the narrative, but Lacey had already disrupted it. He could feel the shift, just as she did, but he couldn't stop it. She had made her mark. She had made them react. Lacey turned her attention to the judge. His eyes flickered toward her, and for a brief moment, she saw a glimmer of wariness in his expression. He had dealt with countless attorneys, but something about her was different. Something about this case had thrown him off balance. And Lacey was perfectly aware of that. The challenge now was not just winning the case. It was about commanding the space. She wasn't going to let anyone push her into a corner, not even the judge. "Ms. Ross," the judge's voice broke the silence, his tone firm but tinged with a subtle hint of caution. "You've made an impression. Let us proceed with professionalism." Lacey's lips curled into a faint smile, one that wasn't about proving something, it was about asserting her authority, making it clear that she was fully in control. "Of course, Your Honor," she said smoothly, her voice cool and even. The words came without hesitation, but beneath the calm facade, there was a fierce determination burning. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "I'm simply presenting the facts, nothing more." Her response lingered in the room, and she saw the faintest flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes. He might have been in control of the court's structure, but in this moment, Lacey had taken control of the narrative. The prosecutor's colleagues were already whispering, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and they were already scrambling to recover. Without missing a beat, Lacey turned toward her team, signaling for her witness to take the stand. Her movements were deliberate, each step taken with the quiet confidence that only came from knowing that she was in charge. The jurors shifted in their seats, and Lacey could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear their thoughts. They were watching her not just as an attorney, but as a woman who had stepped up and claimed her place in the spotlight. The prosecutor tried to make a move, rising in an attempt to assert his presence, but Lacey didn't wait for him to finish. She was already ahead of him, already one step ahead. "Your Honor, I request to call my next witness," she said, her voice steady and controlled, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. For a moment, there was silence. The judge regarded her, his expression unreadable, but Lacey could feel the tension in the room. It was almost as though he was considering whether to challenge her, to remind her of the protocol, of the rules. But he didn't. Instead, after a brief pause, he nodded slowly. "Proceed, Ms. Ross." And just like that, the room shifted again. The jury had seen it. The judge had seen it. The prosecutor had seen it. And Lacey, standing tall, with a small but satisfied smile tugging at her lips, knew she had done exactly what she came to do. She had taken control. She wasn't going to wait for anyone to dictate the terms of this trial. This courtroom, this case, this moment, it was hers. As the witness took the stand, Lacey's heart continued to beat steadily in her chest. She was no longer just an observer of the trial. She was the one shaping it. The prosecutor might try to wrestle control back from her, but the truth was, she had already won the battle for dominance. And from here on out, it was her show to run. The courtroom, which had been filled with the usual tension of a high-stakes trial, suddenly felt like a stage in an unfolding drama. The news of Judge Anderson's suspension came like a thunderclap, shaking the legal community and sending waves of disbelief through the court. For Lacey, the moment felt surreal, almost like she had been waiting for it to happen, yet never truly believed it would. She had fought hard to bring attention to the biases and the unfairness of the judge, but to see it all unravel before her eyes was something she hadn't fully anticipated. In the moments before the announcement, Lacey had been steeling herself for the next round of objections, the next dismissal of her arguments. She could almost feel the weight of the judge's dismissive gaze, the subtle, yet unmistakable, favoritism he showed to the prosecution. But as soon as the news broke, the air in the courtroom shifted. It was as though the ground beneath her had suddenly been pulled away, leaving her to grasp at the fragments of what had just occurred. For a split second, Lacey felt a strange mix of vindication and shock. Vindication, because she had known, deep down, that Judge Anderson had been biased, that he had operated with a hidden agenda. His actions had been so blatant at times, yet he had always seemed untouchable. Now, to hear that he was under investigation for misconduct was like a punch to the gut of the system that had always seemed so impenetrable. She had been right, and the weight of that truth settled over her with a quiet satisfaction. But there was also a sense of disbelief, of almost wondering if it was all too good to be true. Had she truly been able to make a difference? Was this her doing? As the news spread, murmurs swept through the courtroom, growing louder with each passing moment. Lacey could hear the whispers, the disbelief in the voices of both her colleagues and the opposition. Judge Anderson, who had once commanded the room with unshakable authority, was now the subject of intense scrutiny. The rumors about his biased rulings, his favoritism toward the prosecution, and even his unprofessional behavior had all come to light. And just like that, the man who had once been seen as the epitome of justice had been brought down by his own actions. Lacey's heart pounded in her chest, and she forced herself to remain composed, even as she could feel the adrenaline rushing through her veins. She had to maintain control. She had to remind herself that the battle wasn't over, far from it. The judge's suspension was a significant moment, yes, but it didn't change the facts of the case. It didn't make her job any easier. The prosecutor was still out there, still fighting to secure a conviction, and now they were more dangerous than ever. Lacey knew she had to tread carefully. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of emotions. Lacey couldn't escape the feeling that, in some way, she had become part of a much larger story. The investigation into Judge Anderson's conduct was no longer just about one person, it was about the integrity of the entire system. It was about holding people in power accountable. And Lacey, whether she liked it or not, was at the center of it all. Her emotions were all over the place, pride in her ability to stand up against such powerful opposition, but also a lingering fear of what came next. What would the consequences be for her, for the case, for the legal community? Would the prosecutor play dirty now that their ally was gone? Would the system, which seemed so quick to overlook its flaws, begin to turn on itself? At the same time, Lacey couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. There was no denying it, the playing field had shifted. Judge Anderson's suspension had taken away the bias that had tainted every decision he made. The new judge, though unfamiliar with the case, brought with them a sense of impartiality that Lacey had longed for. Finally, there was a chance for the truth to come through. Finally, there was a chance for her to show that her case, and her argument, had merit. As the investigation continued, the legal community was abuzz with theories and speculations. The suspension of a judge of Judge Anderson's stature was unprecedented, and the implications were vast. The case, once overshadowed by the judge's heavy-handed rulings, now felt like it could go in any direction. Lacey's mind raced with possibilities. Could this lead to a retrial? Would the prosecution lose their edge without their favored judge? Would the truth finally come to light? But even with all the excitement of the judge's suspension, Lacey knew she couldn't afford to get complacent. The prosecutor had already demonstrated their willingness to fight dirty, and now, without the judge's bias, they would have to rely on everything they had. Lacey had to remain vigilant. She had to be ready for whatever came next. The moment when the new judge entered the courtroom marked a turning point. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive weight of Judge Anderson's bias was gone, and Lacey felt a small, cautious sense of relief. She had known that the trial needed a fair chance to unfold, but she hadn't realized just how much it had been stifled until that moment. The new judge, though unfamiliar with the case's intricacies, brought with them a refreshing sense of neutrality. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lacey could speak without fear of being dismissed, without the ever-present pressure of an unspoken bias hanging over her every word. Still, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. She had fought hard to bring attention to the issues with the previous judge, but now, the case was entering a new phase. She had to focus on the facts, the law, and her strategy. The stakes were even higher now, and the risks had only increased. But one thing was certain, Lacey wasn't going to back down. She had already challenged the very foundation of the court's authority, and she would continue to fight for the justice that she knew the system had so often failed to deliver. As the trial progressed under the watchful eye of the new judge, Lacey began to feel the weight of her responsibility. This wasn't just about winning the case, it was about restoring faith in the system. It was about showing that even the most powerful individuals, like Judge Anderson, were not above scrutiny. And for Lacey, there was no turning back. She had already come too far. As the days stretched on, the news of Judge Anderson's suspension began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just a story that appeared in local papers or was shared in legal circles anymore, it was a national sensation. A courtroom scandal that had started with a simple accusation was now splashed across headlines everywhere. People were talking about it in coffee shops, at lunch tables, and on social media. The weight of the public's attention became palpable, and Lacey, who had never sought the spotlight, was now at the center of a storm she could never have predicted. For Lacey, the experience felt like being swept away by a powerful tide. What had started as a quiet, calculated move to hold a corrupt judge accountable had now become a media frenzy. At first, the attention had been uncomfortable, her every action was being dissected, her every word scrutinized. It was like standing in front of a massive audience, all of them waiting for her to slip, for her to make a mistake. But as the days passed, the tension began to shift. Lacey started to realize that this was not just about her, it was about something much bigger. The suspension of Judge Anderson had become a symbol, a turning point for the public to believe that perhaps the legal system, often seen as untouchable, could be held accountable. And despite the discomfort, Lacey could sense that her fight was resonating with many people. As the story gained momentum, the emotions Lacey felt were complex and ever-changing. She had always been motivated by a deep sense of justice, but now, as she watched the media circus unfold, she started to feel both proud and overwhelmed. She had always prided herself on her quiet, unassuming nature, never one to seek the limelight, but always ready to fight for what was right. Now, the spotlight was hers whether she wanted it or not, and the expectations of the public were weighing heavily on her. The support was overwhelming, but so was the criticism. the news outlets were split. Some hailed her as a hero, a champion for justice who had taken down a corrupt judge and set an example for the future. Others questioned her motives, accusing her of being too bold, too eager to take down someone with so much power. On social media, the hashtags #JusticeForAll and #accountability in the courts spread like wildfire, drawing thousands of supporters, but there were also those who criticized her actions, calling her naive or claiming that she had no right to challenge the system so openly. At times, it was hard to navigate the flood of opinions. Lacey had always believed in the power of truth, but now, she had to contend with the reality that truth was often overshadowed by narrative. The public didn't just want to hear the facts, they wanted to hear a story. And Lacey was now a character in that story, her every move a piece of the larger puzzle. What had been a professional fight for justice had now become a media spectacle, and Lacey had to adapt to this new reality while keeping her integrity intact. But despite the chaos, there was a sense of quiet determination that kept Lacey moving forward. She never lost sight of why she had started this fight. It wasn't about personal glory or recognition, it was about righting a wrong, about making sure that the justice system could not be manipulated by power and influence. Lacey had always believed that change started with small actions, but now she realized that her actions had ignited something much larger. The public had rallied behind her, and now, more than ever, they were watching closely, waiting to see if she could pull off the impossible, holding a judge accountable. For the legal community, the ripple effects were just as intense. Fellow lawyers, judges, and legal experts were all weighed in, offering their own interpretations of the case. Some applauded her bravery and saw her as a beacon for reform, while others criticized her for exposing the system's vulnerabilities. There were even whispered rumors of potential repercussions for those who supported her. Yet, through it all, Lacey maintained her focus. She had known from the beginning that challenging the establishment came with a price. She had been warned by others who had attempted similar feats and failed. But Lacey was different. She wasn't afraid of the consequences because, for her, the outcome wasn't about personal sacrifice, it was about making the legal system better for everyone who came after. As the media continued to swirl around her, Lacey found herself receiving an increasing amount of attention from advocacy groups. These organizations, dedicated to judicial reform and the fight against corruption, began to rally behind her. They saw her as the face of a much-needed change, and soon, they began to organize their own campaigns, petitions, and rallies. Lacey's name was now associated with a larger movement, one that transcended her individual case and represented a collective fight for fairness, transparency, and accountability in the justice system. Yet, Lacey couldn't ignore the growing tension within the courtroom and the legal world. The prosecutor, a former ally of Judge Anderson, seemed to be growing more defensive by the day. It was clear that the prosecutor had a vested interest in protecting their own reputation, as well as the judges. The public scrutiny was starting to spill over into their legal strategy. Every move, every document filed, was now under intense inspection. But even as the pressure mounted, Lacey remained calm, her resolve hardening. She knew the stakes had only grown higher. She was no longer just fighting for a single case, she was fighting for something larger, something that had the potential to change the entire legal system. For every victory, there was a challenge. The case had attracted attention not just from supporters, but from critics who sought to undermine her. Lacey was no stranger to criticism, but this was different. The attacks were personal, aimed at her integrity and her motivations. They questioned her fitness for the job, suggesting that her personal feelings had clouded her judgment. It stung. But Lacey, as she always did, refused to let the noise distract her. She had learned long ago to tune out the distractions and focus on the task at hand. Her conscience was clear. She had done the right thing. As the public's interest in the case grew, so did the pressure on Lacey. It was no longer just a courtroom drama, it was a political and social issue. People wanted change, and they were looking to her to lead the charge. The media coverage was relentless. Every development, every statement, was dissected. Lacey couldn't escape the scrutiny, but she also couldn't afford to back down. The fight was too important. The story was too big. She was no longer just a lawyer in a courtroom, she was a symbol for the power of one individual to challenge a broken system. Days turned into weeks, and the impact of the case continued to expand. News outlets reported on the story daily, offering live updates, expert commentary, and interviews with legal professionals. The hashtags continued to trend, and protests began to form, calling for judicial reform and accountability across the country. Lacey's role in all of this had become undeniable. She had sparked something much larger than she could have imagined, and now, it seemed, there was no turning back. The story had taken on a life of its own, and Lacey was at the heart of it. In the end, despite the growing tensions and the obstacles she faced, Lacey never lost sight of the bigger picture. She had started this journey with one goal in mind: to seek justice. The story of Judge Anderson's suspension was no longer just about one person, it was about a fight for fairness in a broken system. And Lacey knew, as she walked this difficult path, that even if she had to face criticism, scrutiny, and personal sacrifice along the way, she would never back down. Because for Lacey, this was a battle that was worth fighting, and it was a battle that would change everything. In the aftermath of Judge Anderson's suspension, Lacey found herself standing at the threshold of a world that had been dramatically altered by the events she had just experienced. The weight of what had occurred felt both heavy and surreal, as if she were walking through the fog of a storm that had finally passed. The case, the drama, and the intensity of her fight for justice had left an indelible mark on her. But as the world slowly returned to its routine, Lacey's mind began to sift through the debris of emotions, questions, and self-reflection. Despite the final victory over the corrupt judge, there was no instant feeling of triumph or relief. Instead, a deep and resonant silence settled within her, as if her body and mind had been so deeply immersed in the battle that now, without the constant noise of public attention and pressure, it was hard to find her balance again. The constant media presence, the relentless scrutiny, the public whispers about her every move, it had all faded, but it felt as if Lacey was still stuck in that world, even though it was now behind her. And in the quiet aftermath, she began to confront the feelings that had been buried under layers of adrenaline and determination. Lacey's first realization was that she had grown. The young woman who had walked into the courtroom weeks ago, unsure of how she would be received or whether she could even stand up against such a powerful opponent, had been transformed. She no longer doubted her ability to lead, to stand firm, or to do what was right in the face of overwhelming odds. Every moment of doubt, every glance at the judge's smug face, every step through the corridors filled with whispers had shaped her in ways that were impossible to articulate. She knew now that no matter how heavy the burden, she could carry it. The strength she had gained was not just a result of her victory, but of the quiet confidence that came from knowing she could trust herself in the toughest of circumstances. But with that confidence came a deep reflection on the cost of the battle she had waged. It wasn't just the exhaustion of her mind and body, nor the toll it had taken on her personal life, but the emotional cost that haunted her long after the cameras had stopped flashing. She had given everything to this case, poured her soul into the fight for justice, and in many ways, she had lost a part of herself in the process. The spotlight that had once felt like an uncomfortable weight now seemed like a distant echo, but it had come with its own set of scars. Lacey found herself questioning who she was now, what her identity meant outside of this case. The woman who had fought so fiercely for what was right was no longer just a determined lawyer, but someone who had been forever shaped by this journey. There were moments when Lacey could hardly escape the haunting feeling of loneliness. Even as the world had rallied behind her, supported her cause, and celebrated her success, she had felt isolated in the middle of it all. There had been so many sleepless nights, long discussions with colleagues who shared her passion, and heated debates with those who questioned her methods. But in those quiet moments of solitude, she had come to understand something about herself. The isolation had not been a sign of weakness, but rather a form of clarity. In those moments, when the world around her had faded into the background, she had found her true purpose. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition, it was about knowing she had done everything in her power to make things right. That realization allowed her to begin healing, to understand that she was stronger for having faced the struggle alone, even when she had others by her side. Amidst the introspection, Lacey also began to feel a profound sense of responsibility for the changes she had helped to set in motion. The battle had been personal, but it had also been part of a larger fight for justice, accountability, and integrity in the legal system. It was hard for her to grasp the enormity of the shift that had begun. She hadn't just taken down a corrupt judge, she had illuminated a systemic issue that reached far beyond the walls of the courtroom. She now understood that the fight for justice wasn't confined to a single case or a single moment. It was a continual process, and her role in that process was now a part of her legacy. Lacey spent many days looking back on the journey, trying to process the many lessons that had been woven through the highs and lows. One of the most profound realizations was the importance of resilience, the ability to stay steadfast even when everything seemed to be crumbling around her. In the beginning, when the judge had smirked at her in court, when the other lawyers had underestimated her, when the media had attacked her relentlessly, Lacey had felt that the weight of the world was on her shoulders. There were moments when she felt completely broken, when the pressure seemed too much to bear. But each time, she had found a way to rise again. It wasn't that the weight had gone away, it was that she had learned how to carry it. Through every setback, she had discovered the quiet strength that comes from pushing through adversity. As she reflected on the victory, Lacey also understood the true power of a single voice. Her voice, though it had initially trembled with uncertainty, had grown louder with every challenge, every accusation, and every moment of courage. Lacey had never intended to become a symbol for justice, but in standing up for what was right, she had become exactly that. It wasn't the media frenzy, the applause, or the recognition that mattered, it was the fact that she had spoken up when others had stayed silent. The power of that voice, echoing through the halls of the court, had reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It had ignited a conversation about corruption, about ethics, about what was acceptable in positions of power. Lacey realized that her actions, though personal, had contributed to a greater movement. It was humbling to know that, in standing firm for justice, she had helped to bring about change that would affect many others for years to come. The most difficult lesson for Lacey, perhaps, was the realization that the fight for justice often came at a personal cost. She had sacrificed time, energy, and pieces of herself along the way. But as she sat in the quiet aftermath of it all, Lacey understood that this sacrifice had been necessary. The personal cost was the price of upholding the values that mattered most to her. She realized that, even when faced with overwhelming opposition, one had to be willing to endure the pain, the isolation, and the doubts in order to achieve something greater. The lessons she had learned were not easy, but they were worth it. They had made her stronger, more resolute, and more committed to fighting for what was right, no matter the personal cost. In the end, Lacey knew that the final lesson was about something greater than herself. It was about the enduring power of truth, the courage to stand against the tide, and the belief that, no matter how difficult the road, justice would always find a way. It wasn't about winning for the sake of victory, it was about doing what was right, regardless of the personal toll. Lacey's heart was full of gratitude for the lessons she had learned, for the people who had supported her, and for the strength she had discovered within herself. And as she moved forward, she knew that the journey had only just begun. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But now, Lacey was ready, not just to fight, but to continue learning, growing, and standing firm in her belief that justice would always prevail.